This podcast was recorded on Ghana land.
Hey, Stephen,
Yes, Olivia?
give me your best Olympic gold medal acceptance speech.
I just kept crawling and it just kept working.
Roll the intro.
We need to be sharing ideas and data and helping each other out.
Yeah, I was accidentally wearing a wire. I was basically a spy.
Yeah, that's nightmare fuel.
They're almost like the science version of a crystal ball.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm doing this for my children, 7,800 years old.
Hello and welcome to Off Embargo, a podcast by the Australian Science Media Centre. I'm Stephen Mew.
And I'm Olivia Henry. And on today's show, we're talking about some of the latest sports stories from our news portal Cymex. Today, I'll be sharing some updates about how the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, is managing the mental health of their athletes.
And I'll be talking about another interesting study about heart attacks in young athletes in the US.
That sounds really concerning, especially if it's young athletes. Let's go with yours first.
Yeah, sure. So I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, I played a lot of team sports. I played club soccer for almost 15 or more years. And I also played club tennis as well. And, you know, at that age, you run around out there and you feel like you're the star and you're invincible. You know, there's something that you don't really think too much about, at least in my case, is a heart attack. Did you?
Never really. I mean, especially if you're like lucky enough to be, you know, really healthy, like in your 20s. I feel like you just feel invincible generally, don't you? You just think nothing bad's ever going to happen to you personally.
Those sorts of things happen to other people.
Yeah.
You know, especially heart attacks. I think about that as something that happens to old people. You know, people sort of over the age of 50 or something like that might be more likely to have that happen. But, you know, especially when you're young and fit and you're running around, you don't think about it too much. What we had this week is a study in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, and it came out of the Oregon Health and Science University in the USA, and it looked at the rates of sudden cardiac arrest and death in young athletes in America between the ages of 11 and 27.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And what they found is that a heart attack could happen to people as young as 11 and in a range of settings, including at training. So not just at the game, it could happen at school, it could happen after exercise. And it wasn't just athletes or young people who were sort of at that athlete level. It was anyone from just, you know, the kids at school or whoever that could have a heart attack.
Oh, so is this not just looking at the links between athletics and heart, but just kind of that age group and heart risks? Is what it's looking at?
And what they looked at was things like what would help you survive. The research, you know, it does sort of say that it's a rare thing. So they had 743 young athletes over a 21-year period in the US who had a sudden heart attack. So that's not a huge number of people over that period of time. You know, I think it's
21 years is a long time.
35 people or something like that covered by this study. Obviously, there could have been people that were missed or that sort of thing. And in many of those cases, the underlying cause was something called a cardiomyopathy, which is not just your sort of blockage in a heart valve or something like that. It's something actually structural that's, you know, not quite right. Now, at that point, you know, the study gets a bit technical. So I wanted to know a little bit more about the research. So I actually spoke to Associate Professor Jessica Orchard from the Sydney School of Public Health at the University of Sydney, who's an expert in this area, to find out a little bit more. So we'll have a quick listen to that.
So this is a really good quality paper by expert authors looking at sudden cardiac arrest and death in several databases in the US, looking at rates of survival and cardiomyopathies in particular, which is a subset of all causes of cardiac arrest. So the first thing they found is that these events happened in athletes over a broad age range. So we're talking as young as 11 and up to the age of 27. So we can say very clearly from this data, this is something that can actually affect very young people, not necessarily having to be elite athletes, but all sorts of levels of sport. One of the other things that we can really say from this data is that there are some common things between those who survived. Some of the things that the athletes who survived had in common were that somebody saw it happen, that somebody started CPR straight away, and in many cases there was a defibrillator on site that actually got used. So those things are well understood, but really reinforced to us again where we can target our efforts to further improve survival from sudden cardiac arrest. The stats in Australia are that an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, your chance of survival is still only about 12 or 13%. Very big space to improve that stat. The third thing we can take from these findings is that many of these events happened actually at training and not in a formal game setting. They were spread across all sorts of different venues, from school grounds, public facilities, and all sorts of places. Often when we think about being prepared for cardiac arrest in sport, we do focus most of our thoughts or assume that we're talking about match day. And while that's absolutely still important, this paper does show that we still need to be prepared in a training session as well. When we look a little bit further into who did the CPR, it wasn't just professional people who were very highly trained. There was a really big range of people who delivered CPR, basically anyone who was close by and happy to help. And I think that tells us also that we need to be training as many people as we can to recognise and respond to a sudden cardiac arrest, because time is so much of the essence. It can absolutely be a life and death thing, whether the person right there beside you who sees it is willing to have a go. The fifth thing here is that we're sort of assuming here that exercise was a trigger for some of these cardiomyopathies to turn into a dangerous heart rhythm and a cardiac arrest. But when we have a look at the different types of cardiomyopathies, the exercise-related events were far more common in arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. And so close to 90% of those events were exercise-related. Whereas if we look at hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, it was a little bit lower with only about 2/3. That's an important thing to understand, that some of these different types of underlying conditions have a different relationship with exercise.
Yeah, great. So what should schools and sporting clubs, as well as parents and young people around Australia, sort of be aware of in regards to their risk of this sort of thing happening? Because, like I grew up playing quite a lot of soccer and sports when I was a young person, and I have to say that, myself or someone else having a cardiac arrest was never something that even crossed my mind, sort of as a young person in those settings. So what should people be aware of now?
The first thing to emphasise is that exercise is still super important overall and overwhelmingly good for the heart. So sudden cardiac death in young people and anyone exercising is still very rare. But when it does happen, we absolutely need to be prepared. And I guess two really important red flags to be aware of for anybody is that if you have exercise-related symptoms or collapse or nearly passing out during exercise, perhaps chest pain if you're working hard, maybe your heart racing in a way that feels out of proportion to what you're doing, or something else like the sudden loss of a cylinder, is how one of my colleagues describes it. If you have one of those things, those are symptoms that need to be assessed properly and not just written off. And the second one on that note is family history. And so if you've got a relative who died suddenly or unexpectedly under the age of 50 or even 40 of known cardiac causes like a cardiomyopathy, that definitely should be looked at, because some of these conditions can be inherited. This can also include an unexplained drowning or a single vehicle car accident that has no explanation. So those are two very important things not to ignore if you have them. And then for clubs, the really, really strong message here is that you need to have a plan for how you'll recognise and respond to sudden cardiac arrest. Basically, they say now any collapse should be treated as cardiac until proven otherwise. Respond as though it's cardiac, and if the person sits up at some point and shows you that it's not, then, proceed differently. So absolutely having training for staff members in recognition and response to sudden cardiac arrest, together with an emergency action plan that has been practiced. And ideally have access to an automated external defibrillator, because that really does make a huge difference to survival.
Ashish, could you just explain what a cardiomyopathy is and what the sort of different types that are looked at in this study actually are, just sort of very sort of basic terms?
Yeah, absolutely. So cardiomyopathy is a broad term that refers to diseases of the heart muscle itself. So it's not a blockage, it's not a dodgy valve, it's a disease of the heart itself. And there are several types that are a bit different, and some are more common than others. So in some cases, it might be the muscle is too thick, whereas in other cases, the muscle might be stretched or weak, or even in other cases, gradually replaced by scar tissue. So as I mentioned, a lot of the kinds of cardiomyopathies we might worry about, particularly in young people, are inherited, which is why it's so important to have families assessed properly. And it's also possible to have one of these cardiomyopathies and have absolutely no symptoms at all before a cardiac arrest, and even to be playing sport at a very high elite level. So the most common type that many people might have heard of is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and we think that affects about 1 in 500 people. So that's the one where the muscle of the left ventricle becomes abnormally thick. There's also dilated cardiomyopathy, where the heart stretches out and pumps more weakly. It's probably about similarly common, but one of the ones to mention in particular, especially based on this study, is arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy, and that's where the heart muscle is progressively replaced by sort of fat and scar tissue. It's probably a bit rarer, somewhere between 1 in 2,000, maybe 1 in 5,000, but it's one of the conditions where we really think that intense exercise training, especially endurance exercise, can actively accelerate the disease progression. And so that's why it's disproportionately represented in exercise-related sudden death. So it really is one of those ones where you absolutely need specialist advice.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have any other takeaways in regards to this study that we haven't quite addressed?
Well, I think this study, as I said, has made a lot of points that we already knew quite well, which is that some of these cases are more common in males by quite a lot. Many of these can happen in training or at sporting grounds, and your chances of survival are so much higher if someone recognises that it's a cardiac arrest, if they respond with CPR and ideally a defibrillator, and if they continue that CPR until either the defibrillator or the ambulance arrives. Finally, in real life, those things, it sounds a little bit easier than sometimes it is. So those things only work if there is a defibrillator there with a battery in it. And in many cases, someone who's willing to give it a go. It doesn't have to be perfect, but that giving it a go thing is such an important part of life. And so the clear message of this paper is that we really need broad CPR training because it really can happen anywhere and at almost any age.
Thank you so much, Jess.
That's fascinating. Really, really interesting. So I've got a couple of points that I'm going to take away from this. Well, when you brought this study to me, what I thought you were going to say is that there's a heightened risk of heart issues in athletes for some reason that, is unbeknownst to me. But what you and Jessica were saying is that, we can't say either way that an activity causes heart issues or that more activity will reduce them in every single case. But there are different types of heart issues that need to be addressed differently. So some of them you can speak to your doctor and some of them will say, this one you can reduce your risk of heart issues through exercise. And then some of them take it a bit easy because your heart will be under stress. And you don't know that unless you actually are aware of your family history and the issues that you're having, right?
Yeah, so I think that's a big one, is that these cardiomyopathies are things that you wouldn't necessarily know you had. And like she said, you could have one, especially one specific type of it, and be an elite level athlete and not know until something went wrong. So that's where things like, obviously being in tune with yourself and understanding the way that you're feeling, maybe even when you're training and that kind of thing, and understanding what your body's telling you can help. Even then you may not realize. Being able to understand your family history and what other people in your family have had happen to them, even if it wasn't ruled as a heart attack, like she said, really interestingly, if someone had a car accident that was a bit sort of unexplained, that could have been a heart issue.
That's baffling. Yeah.
Yes. So
fascinating.
And I think she also does mention that, exercising is good for you. Overwhelmingly, it's actually good for your heart. So this isn't to say don't exercise or be worried about exercising. That's the wrong way to go about it, because exercising is really good for your heart. It's just that in some people, they might have an underlying issue. And the thing that we can do about that, other than getting them checked and assessing their family history, is to have other people at the club or around the place who are trained in CPR and to have defibrillators available.
Yes, definitely. And one big thing for me, because I've got kind of disability in my family, so we're always using services and technology of some kind, assistive technology, is to keep it serviced, maintained, and up to date, because it's so easy to have those go by the wayside. Even in, specialized organizations that do this, they forget to service their equipment, and it's so important because it could save a life. Even if this is a rare occurrence, any life saved is worth the time and effort.
Exactly. And that's also a good reminder to check the batteries in your smoke alarms.
Yeah.
'Cause that's one that's in everyone's house. Everyone has it. Well, perhaps we can move on now from that one to your story, Olivia. I'd really like to hear about this one.
Sounds great. So we've talked about the physical health of our local and community athletes, essentially. But what I want to talk about now is the mental health of our Olympians. So I'm going from physical to mental and from community athletes to the most elite athletes that you can get. So this is a paper in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and it came out earlier this week. This was built on a consensus statement from 2019 originally. So the first one is 2019. Consensus statement is basically a bunch of experts coming together, looking at everything they know about the topic from different angles and saying, okay, well, now we've got all this information. This is what needs to be done. Here's a list of things that we need to think about and we need to do to protect the mental health of our athletes.
Got
okay,
it.
you
A
with
bunch
me?
of nerds giving their expert opinion on a specific topic.
Yes, exactly. A lot of stuff came out of this original one. So they launched like diploma and certificate programs and standardized screening and all of this stuff. You can actually go on the IOC website and type in athlete mental health toolkit and it comes up what came out of this first one. So what they did this time was they brought together 31 more people with lived experience and clinical and scientific expertise. So a little bit of everybody. Then they looked at what needs to be done now. So, we've done this, we've got the toolkit already, now what? And what they found is that athletes aren't working in a vacuum. There's a whole ecosystem of staff and supportive people that are contributing to athlete mental health. And so this new agreement between all of these professionals is basically now we have to start looking at sports as an interconnected system. So they're looking at coaches, caregivers, sports staff, organizations and governing bodies, but also the media and the public, so us and how we're reacting to athletes, which is really, really fascinating, I think, because I often forget that athletes are people with feelings in a sense. Like, do you
Wow, okay.
I mean
You heard
that
it
in a
here
way.
first.
I mean that in a way that, like, I always look at an athlete and go, oh, they're so cool, they're so strong, and they're because they're often kind of fit and attractive and they seem to have it all figured out. And so you kind of look at them as this almost a celebrity sometimes, that they've got it all figured out, right? But the way that we see them and the way that they see themselves is very different. So all these athletes also eventually transition out of sport in one way or another, because that's life.
Yeah.
And they were saying that you need to start looking at what happens when you dedicate your life to something and then transition out of it. That's a huge factor in mental health.
Yeah.
And so they were talking about that. But one of the most interesting things that came out of this when I was reading the editorial that came with it, so usually they have these statements and then they have someone commenting on the statement and kind of summarizing it and what it means. So I was reading that and the editorial was saying, you need to figure out if the athlete is depressed or if they're burnt out and overtrained, because one of them is an internal thing that you can help from talking to a clinician. The other one is your coach overtraining you or, expectations from outside, right? And then it's like, do they have anxiety disorder or are they really stressed because they really want to do well? Those are two that, the feelings might be the same, but the cause and therefore the treatment will be different. And then there's the little superstitions and rituals that athletes do.
Yeah.
So, the kissing the necklace or something like that. Do you have any athletes that do that?
I know there's at least one AFL player who will often go out on the ground before the game and eat a piece of grass.
Oh, my goodness.
I think barefoot too.
Oh, wow.
There's at least one who goes out barefoot.
And that's the thing. And that this editorial was saying, is that a cute little superstition and ritual or is that obsessive compulsive disorder?
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily mean it's one or the other, but, I know for myself when I used to play volleyball, I used to find that if I didn't stand a certain way when I was serving, then I would bung the serve every time. And for me, in my head, that's just muscle memory. But at what point does it become unhealthy and you can't go without doing it,
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the usual awful extra things like substance use disorders, eating disorders that would come with having that body image and the whole world looking at you.
Yeah.
And you know, all those things. So it might be a product of their environment rather than just coming from a feeling of within. And that's a really important new kind of recommendation that this consensus statement is making.
Yeah. So they're taking a bit more of a wider look at everyone around the issues. Well, everyone around the athlete, maybe not the issue, but everyone around the athlete, not just the athlete themselves. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So it's a bit of a Ted Lasso situation.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they're basically saying what they're recommending is routine screening at defined time points. So let's say that they have a really big event coming up or they're just about to retire. Like those are some good times to check in. Regular reviews that are treatment but aren't just about treatment but also tailored and evidence-based and culturally appropriate. So, you know, if you're American, then you might have a very, very different need than someone from Southeast Asia, for example, because the culture is very different. And then psychological responses to injury, for example, needs to be assessed. So, you know, when do they go back? Are they going to rush back or are they going to, you know, take their time? And how is that affecting their mental health to not be able to train every day or reduce their training and not be hitting those milestones? It's a big deal for them.
It's interesting when, in this case, they're looking at Olympic athletes and the Olympics rolls around every 4 years. And I wonder if there are differences in the way that those athletes are experiencing things like stress and just even the training regimen that they have to go through to get up to that level of competing in the Olympics compared to someone who's still at an elite level but playing something more like Premier League soccer or AFL football, where it's more of a yearly cycle to get to the maximum level, if you know what I mean. I would be intrigued to know if there's been any studies in that area.
Yeah, definitely. Well, something to keep an eye out, and we'll have to look more into it in the future. Well, that's all we've got time for today, so thank you for tuning in. If you would like to hear more about us and what we do, you can visit smc.org.au.
And if you love what we do and you want to support us, you can click the donate link. This helps us keep supporting journalists to accurately report science, and it helps us make more podcasts as well. And of course, all of your donations are tax deductible.
And if you're a journalist or researcher who would like to work with us, or if you want to read some interesting science stories like the ones we talked about today, you can visit our news portal, that's scimex.org. We'll be back in a few weeks with another episode. Until then, catch you next time.
See ya.
Off Embargo is a podcast by the Australian Science Media Centre.
It's written, hosted and produced by Stephen Mew and Olivia Henry.
Our theme music is by Adelaide artist and producer Nathan Huai.
And our editing is by Stephanie Heffron.
This podcast was made possible by a science engagement grant from Inspiring South Australia.
And a special thank you goes to Justin MacArthur and the Peas in Her Network.